Hi there. Today I want to talk about the representation of time in Oliver Messiaen's Quatuor pour la fin du temps, or the Quartet for the End of Time. Apologies in advance for any terrible French pronunciation. I apologize. As you can tell from the title alone, Quartet for the End of Time, time really figures prominently in this piece, and so I wanted to take a look at a few ways it shows up and is part of this piece's structure. But first of all, if you don't know who Oliver Messian is, he was a French composer, organist, teacher, and ornithologist, actually. He was one of the most innovative composers of Western classical music in the 20th century, and he experimented with and was inspired by several factors, including birdsong, colors of music. He had synesthesia, ancient and medieval methods of composition, like Gregorian chant and Greek rhythms, total serialism, and techniques of other music traditions, in particular Indian classical music and gamelan. And I'll talk a little bit more about Indian classical music in a few minutes. And Quatuor pour la fin du temps is one of his most famous and important compositions. And like I said, and you can tell from the title alone, time is a big part of this piece. So I want to take a look at a few of the components of time in this quartet in three headings. The first is looking at what he means when he talks about the end of time. And the second two, the rhythmic patterns and representation of eternity, will be taking a closer look at how he deals with time in the actual music itself. But first of all, what does he mean when he's talking about the end of time? Messiaen was a devout Catholic, and he frequently used a lot of Christian imagery and inspiration for his music. And this piece is no exception. The inspiration for this piece comes from this passage in Revelations, which deals with the end of all time, deals with the end of humankind, where one angel comes out and hails the end of time. And so this biblical event is the inspiration and crux of this entire piece. However, it's hard to talk about this piece without also talking about its historical time. Messiaen himself denied this piece's historical time as its real influence, but it's a major part of this composition. If you remember the date in 1941, this piece was composed during World War II. And Messiaen served in the French army during the Second World War and was actually captured by German forces. And while a prisoner of war, Messiaen composed and premiered this work in a prisoner of war camp. And he performed with three other musicians who were also prisoners of war. And the premiere happened for the prisoners and the guards. You can see here the cover of the original score, which gives the stalag where it happened. And it's this incredible image of this beautiful composition being performed in the middle of a war camp. Like I said, Messiaen said that the historical time didn't influence his choice of inspiration, but it's hard to imagine being a audience member in that moment and not thinking about the end of time, and especially as it relates to you. And so thinking about the end of time for the prisoners and their families, or the Second World War as an apocalyptic event, or at the end of time for France being invaded by Germany. There's a lot going on here, even if Messiaen wasn't explicitly inspired by his circumstances. But he did have a double meaning intended in mind when he was talking about this piece. It's not historical, rather it's musical. And so when he's referring to the end of time, he's not just talking eschatologically as in the end of all time, but musically as well. And musically about the end of time as is presented within Western classical music. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. So if you want, look now at the time as it's presented within this piece. There's a lot to uncover here, but I'm briefly going to touch on just a few things. Messiaen himself was very interested in rhythm and music. All musics deal with time, temporality in some form or another. If there's one that doesn't, please let me know, because I'd be interested to know about it. And most frequently, the way it's dealt with is through the form of rhythm and meter, and different traditions have different emphasis. on rhythm and meter. Within Western classical music, broadly speaking, this is a generalization, rhythm is really not as valued as harmony, and so rhythm becomes subservient to harmony. But Messiaen was really interested in developing his own rhythmic language and looking at the independence of rhythm a little bit more. And so he carefully studied the rhythmic practices of a lot of other music traditions, and one of which was Indian classical music. And he was one of the main Western classical composers who started experimenting with and borrowing from Indian classical music's Tala system. I'm going to very briefly touch on Tala. I'm not going to do it enough justice to this incredibly rich tradition, but Tala within Indian classical music, broadly speaking, is the rhythmic or temporal framework of Indian classical music. It's the foil to raga, which is the melodic framework. And generally, it's different in Northern and Southern Indian classical music, but generally it's a set of repeated patterns and meters that mark the passage of time in a piece. And the structure is a bit broader than it is within Western classical music, and I think there's more of a significant interplay between raga and tala, i.e. pitch and time, or note and time. So Messiaen was introduced to this system relatively early in his career, and he was fascinated by its characteristics and its qualities and the ways that he could experiment with it. And he, in turn, began introducing Tala into his own pieces in this broader rhythmic language. And the Quartet for the End of Time is actually a relatively early example of Tala in his music. And he's really inspired by a few characteristics of Tala that you see in his music, and especially in relation to the idea of time. The first is the independence of pitch and rhythm. Like I said, there's this interplay between raga and tala. And I think to an extent, Messiaen is sort of trying to emulate that in the first movement here. This is a piano part. And you can see here, you have these two different lines, one that says chords and one that says values. And basically, for the chords, he has a cycle of 29 chords that he's moving through. However, for the values, he has a cycle of 17 rhythmic values that he cycles through. And so these are repeated, but of course they're different lengths, and so they're not going to line up. So the first time you hear value 1 and chord 1, yes, of course they line up, but the next time you hear value 1, you're going to hear chord 18. Or the next time you hear chord 1, you're going to hear value 13. And so Messiaen creates this distinction between pitch and rhythm and starts to destabilize the idea of time necessarily being subservient to rhythm. The other aspect of Tala that I think he was really interested by was the presence within some Tala of non-retrogradable rhythms, which is a very confusing way of saying rhythms that are the same forward and backwards. You can't play a non-retrogradable rhythm backwards because it's just the same as playing it forward. And so again, this is from the first movement of the quartet in the cello line now. And he creates these cells of non-retrogradable rhythms. So essentially what happens is that the rhythms start to loop over themselves. You can't play one without starting to play the next. And then by the time you play the next, you start to play the one again. And so it cycles. And so in essence, he creates a rhythm that is continuous and has no beginning or no end. Again, he's messing with our idea of time and rhythm passing and creating this cyclical sense. So that's Tala and rhythmic patterns in his quartet. The other really interesting thing to talk about, I think, is how he represents the idea of eternity. The idea of eternity in his figures very prominently in the fifth movement of the quartet. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of music. It's for solo, cello, and piano. And I think it's the emotional peak of the entire piece. If you're going to listen to anything from this quartet, I'd say you should listen to this, but I think it really works within the context of the entire piece. And as I'm not going to pronounce the French there, but the title translates to Praise to the Eternity of Jesus. And as the title says, it deals with the concept of eternity, but that's pretty difficult to depict, especially within Western classical music. But I think Messiaen goes about doing it by representing eternity through the idea of atemporality, as in he tries to remove the sense of the passage of time, and that's how he represents eternity. And he does this in a few techniques. The first here, this is the first page of the quartet, and it shows all of them really nicely. The first is that he starts to use unequal bar lengths. For most Western classical music, a piece of music is divided into into bars, and these bars are almost always of equal length. They'll be told at the top with a time signature, and for a lot of pieces, it'll be the same all the way throughout. It makes it very easy to read, but it does artificially break up a line. But in this piece, Messiaen rather put some bar lines for phrasing and musical bites, and so what this creates is experience as a listener, though, especially if you're used to listening to Western classical music, but even if you don't necessarily listen to that much Western classical music, you do lose sense of the passage of time. You're always sort of aware of where you are in an equal bar. And so when you have an unequal bar, you kind of lose all sense of where you are in the piece. The other thing worth pointing out is the tempo of the piece. It's there in the French, it says infinitely slow. And the tempo is 44 beats equals a 16th note, which means a quarter note is roughly as 11 beats per minute. As a point of reference, I think Billie Jean's like 116, or The Weeknd's Blinding Lights is 170 something. So this is incredibly slow. So this really stretches out the piece. And as a listener, it becomes infinitely slow. And it feels like the notes last forever and expand out forever. And the last element that he uses is this steady piano line throughout. There are a couple of times when the piano doesn't play a few bars. But besides that, the piano plays basically constant 16th notes, and the only change that happens are chordal changes or harmonic changes. And this adds that sensation of the cello solo, because you sort of lose track of where you are in the pattern of the piano line. You don't know when the chord is going to change again, or you can't really remember when it changed last or how many notes it's played and therefore you don't know how many to expect to come. And so all these elements combine together to an extent to create this experience of a piece that doesn't feel tied to time, especially time as we're used to in Western classical music. And so in this way, he creates a piece that is eternal. It still has arc and events, and it still progresses to a point. So it's not a boring piece of music, but instead it's a piece that just is stretched out and doesn't feel like it exists in an ordered time, but it exists in a time of its own. That's a very brief look at the question of time in Messiaen's music. I would encourage you to go listen to the piece if you haven't. I hope this little talk has opened up a little bit a different way to think about time in his music. Thanks very much.